chat box. It's nice to have all of you here today, and I'm excited to be partnering with Prevent Child Abuse New York again to provide you with some more information related to the work that you're doing. And today we're going to be talking about engaging with perpetrators of domestic violence. I just want to take a minute to introduce myself. My name is Bonnie Allen. I use the pronouns she, her, or hers. And I've been with the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence it'll be 9 years on June 4th now. And most of my work is related to the intersections of domestic violence, mental health, and substance abuse. I do a lot of work around child welfare and the intersections of child welfare work and domestic violence. And I'm very happy, as I said, to be here with you today. Prior to working at OPDV, I did most of my work, and that's amazing to me to say, but for over about 30 years now, I've worked with families in many different capacities. I've worked with survivors and their children in domestic violence programs, in both residential and non-residential programs. I've worked with perpetrators of domestic violence. I worked with them for 20 plus years in an offender accountability program that operated both in the community and in the county jail. So a lot of the information that I'm going to be bringing to you today is based on my experience of working with perpetrators, but also my experience of working with survivors and children and the many systems that address domestic violence. I myself worked and supervised and managed programs where people worked in people's homes. So I'm very familiar with what it's like to be in people's homes and providing services to families. And again, that's the experience that I'm bringing to you today, particularly about working with perpetrators. In the beginning of the presentation today, I'm just going to do a little bit of introduction to OPDV and our work and kind of a very brief overview of domestic and gender-based violence. And then we will move into our kind of core of the presentation, which is recognizing, responding, and working with perpetrators. The New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence is the only state in the nation that has a cabinet-level state agency that deals with gender-based violence. And that's really a statement of the values that we have in New York and our priorities in addressing gender-based violence. We address gender-based violence through public policy, education, and public awareness, and we partner with a statewide network of domestic violence service providers to ensure that survivors are receiving services that are trauma-informed, culturally responsive throughout New York State. The kind of three pillars of our work with survivors is that we want all work and anyone who is dealing with survivors of domestic violence or perpetrators of domestic violence, as you're going to hear me talk about today, that all services that are provided are survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally responsive. And as we move through the presentation today, it's going to be very clear what that means when we're doing work and we're engaging with families. New York State is committed to these three pillars in all of our work. New York State has a trauma-informed network, which provides great resources about being trauma-informed and providing trauma-informed services. So I encourage people to Google and look at the New York State trauma-informed. I think they just changed the name to Resource Network. And Maggie can send you that information when she does her follow-up stuff as well. And New York State also has a trauma champion program, which is made up of many state agencies that are also committed to making sure that as agencies, we are trauma informed and that the programs that we support and fund and partner with are also providing trauma informed services. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about working with perpetrators of domestic violence, and we're hoping that you gain a greater understanding of perpetrators of domestic violence. We're going to be talking about what some of the indicators are or characteristics of perpetrators. We're going to be talking briefly about coercive control and the tactics that perpetrators use. And then we're going to be spending a significant amount of time on how to engage with perpetrators. And when you are engaging with perpetrators, we want you to be thinking about what are their strengths, what are the ways that you can engage that hold them accountable for their actions and their behaviors, and what are the appropriate referral sources when you suspect or identify that someone is actually a perpetrator of domestic violence. Before we get started today, I just want to take a moment to say that domestic violence is a difficult topic. And because unfortunately it is so prevalent, we are aware that when we do these presentations, that many people in our audience may have some personal experience with domestic violence. We know that people may have been a victim or a survivor of domestic violence. We know that oftentimes people in our audience may have grown up in a home where there was domestic violence. And so I just want to be very clear that we encourage you to practice self-care. If there's anything about this presentation that's difficult for you or brings up some things that are painful, we encourage you to reach out to the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline number. You can also reach out to the crisis text line number, and Maggie can go ahead and put that information. Oh, it looks like she already did. Thank you, Maggie. The hotline number is a great resource for you and the families that you're working with. But also, as I mentioned, if there's anything that's difficult about today's presentation, you have access to those too, to reach out for support and assistance. And we encourage you to do that. The information that I'm going to be presenting today is going to be in alignment with the Safe and Together model. New York State is in the process through OCFS and a partnership with OPDV of training all child welfare workers, CPS workers, foster care workers, investigative workers, preventative workers in this Safe and Together model. And so when we are presenting information to anyone now, we want to make sure that we are presenting consistent information across the board. And so I want everyone to be aware that the information that we're presenting today, some of it comes from that Safe and Together model. And the principle of the third principle is the model, is the place where we're going to be focusing today. And so that third principle of the Safe and Together model is intervening with perpetrators to reduce risk and harm. And we're going to do that by how we engage with perpetrators, how we hold them accountable. And what this model recognizes that even if the court is not holding or law enforcement or those things, survivors are not comfortable with those systems, as child welfare workers, as home visitors, there's ways that you can encourage and promote accountability in terms of how you engage with perpetrators, in terms of how you partner with survivors, in terms of the referrals you make, and in terms of your documentation. And so I just want everyone to be aware of the Safe and Together model because it really is a great model for working with families who are experiencing domestic violence. This is the multiple pathways to harm. This is also information from the Safe and Together model. And I want to show you this just so that you kind of have a understanding of what the model is and how we think about this model. So what the Safe and Together model does is it recognizes that there are multiple ways that children may be harmed when there's domestic violence in the family. And the model really focuses on what are the perpetrator's actions and behaviors towards the adult survivor and what actions are being taken specifically to harm the children. And the model recognizes that the harm to the children can be multiple in multiple ways, right? Children may be harmed behaviorally, emotionally, socially, educationally, developmentally, and they also may have physical injuries. It's not always a direct path of how that harm comes. So sometimes that harm comes because the perpetrator's coercive control has an impact on the survivor's parenting, and then that has an impact on the child. Sometimes the direct physical abuse that the child is experiencing or the fact that they're seeing or hearing or aware of the abuse is where the harm is going to come from. We also know that when perpetrators are using coercive control and abusive tactics, that can affect the family and how the family functions. So it can affect the family income, housing stability, loss of contact with support systems, educational and social disruptions. And so the point of this is that children have the potential to be harmed in multiple ways when there's domestic violence, and that can take multiple pathways of how that harm shows up. I want to take a minute to talk about language. You're going to hear me use victim and survivor interchangeably. Anyone can be a victim or survivor of domestic violence. Domestic violence happens in same-sex relationships. Men can be victims and survivors. Females can be victims and survivors. This is considered gender-neutral language when I'm using victim or survivor because I'm not assigning a gender. At some points during the presentation, I may use more gender-responsive language, and gender-responsive language language reflects the data and statistics that we see, which shows that oftentimes women are more likely to be victims of domestic violence. And so sometimes I will be, and oftentimes in your cases and in child welfare cases, it is often the mother that is identified as the victim. And so sometimes I will use gender responsive language, and I may refer to the mother as the victim and the father as the perpetrator. That is not in any way to take away from the fact that men can also be victims of domestic violence. They can be victims of female perpetrators or male perpetrators. What New York State data shows us is that 80% of victims of domestic violence are women. And so that we will use sometimes that more gender responsive language. We also use perpetrator, abusive partner, person who causes harm to refer to the person who is using the abusive tactics or the coercive control in the relationship. I may also use offender, and what we're talking about here is people who perpetrate acts of domestic violence or using coercive control to gain and maintain power and control over their partner. We also have really widened our lens at OPDV to talk not just about domestic violence, but to look under that larger umbrella of gender-based violence. And gender-based violence is violence or threats that happen because of someone's sex, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity or expressions, or other related characteristics. So when we're talking about gender-based violence, I want you to think about it as an act that is directly related to or justified by using the gender of the victim or survivor. Gender-based violence can be perpetrated by an intimate partner, by a family member, a neighbor, an acquaintance, or a stranger. Gender-based violence can happen in public or in private, in the workplace. It can happen really anywhere. Today, kind of in the introduction to our presentation, I'm going to be talking about two types of gender-based violence. I'm going to be talking about domestic violence, and then we're going to provide a little bit about sexual violence, as we know that oftentimes we see an overlap, and there's a lot of intersections between domestic violence and sexual violence. So these are the two pieces of gender-based violence that we're going to be exploring this morning. Like I said earlier, domestic and gender-based violence is very prevalent, unfortunately. We know that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men have experienced contact, sexual, physical violence, and or stalking by an intimate partner during their lifetime and have reported some form of IPV-related impact as a result of that violence. And when we're talking about sexual violence, those numbers increase to 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men who have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetime. So the numbers are high, right? And when you look at those numbers, I present the data and the statistics because I want people to be aware, right? If you're working with 10 families, say, if you take those numbers, right? So at least 4 of those families are going to be experiencing 4 of those women are going in those families are going to be experiencing domestic. And those are the cases that we know about, right? I always say that domestic and gender-based violence and sexual violence is underreported. So and many people never come forward, right, for a variety of reasons. So those are kind of what we know about. And so for me, it's always safe to assume, right, that the numbers are higher than that. So when you're looking at your caseloads, it's pretty, whether they're identified as domestic violence or not, you can be pretty well assured that you will be having cases and working with families that are experiencing domestic and sexual violence. And unfortunately, we know that for specific populations or communities, including people of color, people in the LGBTQI plus communities, communities that have fewer resources experience domestic and gender-based violence at even greater rates than what we just saw. And that is due to a concept called intersectionality. And when we're talking about intersectionality, it's basically that we experience life, sometimes discrimination, sometimes benefits based on a number of different identities that we have. The term intersectionality was originally coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she explains it as in terms of giving an example, such as Black women are not discriminated, Black women are discriminated against, sorry, not just as Black people and not just as women, but as Black women. And so this concept of intersectionality is really meant to help us think about the fact that discrimination can happen based on multiple factors at the same time. And so we need to have some type of language to be able to discuss and address that. And so this language really helps us to look at how does race, culture, class, gender, and all of those other kind of foundational identities that people have, how does that impact domestic violence? How does the perpetrator use survivors' intersectionalities or their own as tactics of power and control, right? They may use the survivor's race, culture, gender as tactics of power and control. A survivor's intersectionalities may make it more uncomfortable for them to reach out and accept services and support. And perpetrators may often use their own intersectionalities as excuses for their abusive behavior. So it's important for us to, in all of our work with families, to be aware of what role are the intersections and intersectionalities playing. I want to give you an example just so that it's clear. So I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to refer to her as Miss Sarah. Miss Sarah is a new immigrant to her community. Her husband, Kareem, would not allow her to interact with anyone on her own. He always accompanied her everywhere, to the grocery store, the laundromat, even when she was taking her daughter to the park. After the birth of their daughter, the doctor cautioned Miss Sarah and Kareem that another pregnancy could result in the loss of her life. Despite Miss Sarah being scared to get pregnant again, Kareem has refused to allow her to use birth control. He reminds her over and over again that she has no legal status in this country and that if she goes out alone or talks to the police, they will deport her. And so there's a lot of intersectionalities here that are playing a role. And you can see some of the challenges that those intersectionalities are going to bring for Miss Sarah to reach out and get help. And you can also see how her abusive partner is using those intersectionalities to keep her from accessing resources and support and to keep her afraid. So that's an example of intersectionality. You also hear that in this example that the abusive partner is using reproductive coercion. He's not allowing her to make decisions around her reproductive health care and her decisions about whether or not to have another child. We're going to be talking mostly today about domestic violence. We define domestic violence as a pattern of behavior used by an individual to establish and maintain power and control over their intimate partner. The behavior often includes abusive tactics, threats, and actions that may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. And oftentimes the tactics include physical, emotional, financial, and sexual abuse. And we're going to talk about what some of those tactics are. I really like this slide because it really gives us a picture of what domestic violence looks like. This is the same family, oftentimes out in public or when a home visitor comes to the house or when they're in their faith community, when they're going to work. The picture on the left is what we often see and what we kind of think of as the family. What we don't see is oftentimes what's going on behind closed doors. And so it's important to recognize, I think we think of domestic violence as this picture on the right. We're not going to often see this picture on the right. We're going to see what's happening on the left, and we're not going to make assumptions, right, that there's any domestic violence. This family on the left looks like a happy, functioning family. They may be very involved in the community. The perpetrator may be doing great things in the community, showing up at the kids' soccer games and dance classes. But what we need to remember is that what we see on the outside is not always representative of what may be going on in the home. And as I was saying before, a lot of domestic violence goes unreported because it's not seen, right? So the things that are reported is maybe where there's physical violence, where someone went to the hospital, where someone asked for an order of protection, where someone called the police and there was an incident report filled out, right? So those are the cases that are reported and are documented. That's just, like I said, the very tip of the iceberg. All of the stuff that we often see and that's not reported is the financial control that's happening, the name calling, things that don't rise to the level of criminal behavior, but are very powerful tactics for gaining and maintaining power and control. And so we talk a lot about moving away from just that idea of domestic violence being physical violence, and we really like to talk and focus on coercive control. Coercive control is a systematic attack on another person's freedom and ability to control their own life. It is an act or pattern of acts, threats, humiliation, and intimidation that is used to harm, punish, or frighten. Right. And so we want to really start to define domestic violence, not as the presence or absence of physical violence, but we really want to focus on the other tactics of coercive control beyond that physical violence. Some of the worst cases of domestic violence that I have seen have not included physical violence, but they've included forcing someone to use substances, not allowing someone access to transportation, not allowing someone access to health care or counseling, threats, manipulation, verbal abuse can be very damaging. And because domestic violence, it always has that common theme of gaining and maintaining power and control, but every single perpetrator really designs their tactics around where their survivor is most vulnerable and what they know that is going to work based on their family, their situation, and their survivor. So this is a power and control wheel that we adapted from the original Duluth model. And what it does a really good job at is categorizing the different types of coercive control that a partner may be using. And so you'll see sexual abuse, spiritual abuse, using technology, isolation. And so this wheel kind of categorizes very generally the different types of abuse, but how a perpetrator will use these tactics will play out differently in every single family and every single situation. One of the things that is important to remember is that domestic violence does not usually happen immediately in a relationship. It usually happens very slowly. Oftentimes survivors will say to me, I've heard many survivors say, I don't know how I ended up here. I used to have a full life. I had family, I had friends, I had a good support system, I had a job. I was confident and competent. And over time, what has happened is that perpetrator has really whittled away at their life very slowly to the point that little by little relationships have gone away. They're not allowed to work anymore. Their self-esteem has been diminished over time. And because it happens so slowly and oftentimes in ways that are very manipulative and hidden, oftentimes survivors don't even realize that that's what's happening or that what they're experiencing is domestic violence. I want to look quickly at a few of the kind of tactics that we see a lot that perpetrators use that work very well. Technology abuse. We all know how connected we are now to our technology and our phones and our social media. Perpetrators will use technology to stalk and track survivors, to find out what survivors are doing. They will threaten to embarrass or shame survivors by posting things on their social media accounts. They may track them through using Find My Location or air tags. This type of technology abuse is a very powerful way for perpetrators to know where survivors are, to know what they're doing, and to make survivors afraid because they may feel like that perpetrator is constantly aware of what they're doing and where they're at. This is a polling question. Maggie, do you want to go ahead and do this? So you can select your answer. What percentage of domestic violence cases include financial abuse?
So I've launched it and we've got lots of responses.
I see. I love when I see the activity. I love when I see people in the chat box and in polling questions, because it makes me feel like, oh, people are really out there. They're paying attention. They're listening.
And I was writing a little message in the chat, but just so as everyone's answering, I am keeping track of everyone's questions in the chat box.
Oh, perfect.
Depending on if we have time, Bonnie, I'll read them aloud to you, or we can hold them till the end. But
okay, perfect. Yes, and if we first, I really want to make sure that I address questions. I'm happy doing that as they come. If you want to interrupt me, I'm happy doing it at the end. If for some reason we don't get to it, I can put the answers and we can send them out to people, but I definitely want to make sure people's questions get answered.
Okay, so if it's okay, I'm going to close this poll.
Okay.
We can unpack it and then I'll read you aloud a question we received about the last couple of slides.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So the correct answer is actually D, and it is 99%, which basically means that every case where there's domestic violence, there is some form of financial abuse. Can you share the results, or I'm just going to close this? So
I did. Most people
okay.
were between C and D.
All right, perfect. Oops, did I go past where I wanted to go? So financial abuse is a very powerful tactic of domestic violence. It can include not allowing the survivor access to money. It can include putting all of the debt in the survivor's names. It can include even if the survivor is the primary earner in the family, making sure that money goes into a joint account and then not allowing the survivor to access that money or decide or make choices or decisions about how to spend that money. You may be interfering with a survivor's ability to get to work, showing up at their work, at their job, causing them to lose their job and not be able to earn money. There's multiple ways that perpetrators will use financial abuse. And it is one of the ways that perpetrators really limit the options and choices for survivors around how they're going to get safe, or if it is their choice to leave that relationship. If I've destroyed your credit, it's going to be really hard for you to leave and find a safe place to live and get an apartment or get a car if you don't have access to money and I have destroyed your credit. Gaslighting is another really powerful tactic. It's a big part of coercive control. It's when an abusive partner tries to make the victim doubt their reality or tries to convince them that something isn't actually happening or it's not as bad as they believe it to be. The tactic can be especially powerful when the survivor has mental health or substance use issues, because they will use gaslighting in combination with mental health and substance use coercion. And so oftentimes what happens is survivors begin to doubt their own reality. They begin to doubt their own perceptions, their own memory, and they oftentimes then become even more dependent on the perpetrator for what's real and for what's happening. Did you want to ask those questions, Maggie, before I go into the next section?
Yes, it pertains to coercive control. So this participant asked, does coercive control require intentionality from the perpetrator, like the intention to control, or would the term also cover situations in which there's controlling and coercive dynamics, but they emerge in other ways?
That is a really great question. When we think about domestic violence as we define it as purposeful and intentional behavior. And so I guess the answer to that is if it's coercive control in a domestic violence situation, we would consider that would be purposeful and intentional behavior. There may be someone that's exercising coercive control in some ways, right? Maybe they're very purposely not allowing people access to the finances. And maybe they are gaslighting that person. They may not be, I guess it's possible, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, right? That they may not, well, I think for it to be domestic violence, it has to be intentional and purposeful. That doesn't mean that someone can't be engaging in certain behaviors that are manipulative, that are controlling and coercive, whereas that they may not be aware that that's what's happening. My guess would be if someone is using those things, they're using other tactics that are very purposeful and intentional that go along with it. Does that answer your question? It's a really good question. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, that's gaslighting. I just want to take a minute to really point out the intersections. We talked about intersectionalities. I want to spend a minute talking about intersections of mental health and substance use. We know that oftentimes domestic violence does not happen in a silo. We know that oftentimes the families that we're working with are dealing with multiple issues. And what we want to be aware, what I want you to be aware of is that it's not that they're all separate issues. I mean, they are separate issues, but they influence each other and they intersect with each other. So when domestic violence is present and mental health is present or substance use is present, just like a perpetrator may use a survivor's race, ethnicity, and gender as a tactic of coercive control, they may use a survivor's mental health or substance use issues as tactics of power and control as well. And so we want to be aware of kind of the role that those intersections are playing. Perpetrators will also use their own mental health and substance use issues as excuses for their behavior. And so oftentimes we'll see perpetrators that are interfering with us. First of all, they may cause a substance use or mental health issue. If the survivor already has a mental health or substance issue, the perpetrator may make it worse by engaging in those coercive control tactics. And oftentimes when survivors want to go into recovery or get treatment or go to counseling, perpetrators very frequently will interfere with their ability to get that help and support. I'm going to skip that polling question because I feel like we just went over that information. Another intersection that we often see is intersections of suicide and domestic violence. We recently did a training and a webinar for suicide prevention workers, and then the suicide prevention workers came and talked to domestic violence service providers because there's so many intersections. Oftentimes when we're talking about suicide and domestic violence, those intersections are really complex. Perpetrators may threaten suicide as a tactic. If you leave me, I'll kill myself. So you'll hear that, and it can be really hard to figure out, are they just using that as a tactic, or is it possible that this person is really might commit suicide? We need to take every single threat of suicide seriously because we know that prior domestic violence and threats of suicide are one of the biggest risk factors for when there is murder-suicide. So oftentimes, if a perpetrator is going to commit suicide, they're going to do it after they have committed homicide, right? After they have killed their partner and sometimes after they have killed their children. We see those cases, unfortunately, way too often in the news. And so anytime, a survivor mentions to you that their partner has threatened suicide or that one of the reasons they're afraid to leave is because they're afraid their partner will kill themselves, that's a big risk factor that we really need to pay attention to. The other thing that I really want to point out is that when perpetrators will use the survivor's mental health or substance use as a tactic, it's a very powerful tactic because they use it as a way to create fear that survivor may lose access to their children. So some of the ways that they use mental health and substance use coercion are they talk about the survivor as crazy or mentally ill, or they refer to the survivor as an addict in front of the children. So kind of influencing how the children see that other survivor or that parent. They may tell other systems, right? The child welfare system, the court system, law enforcement, she's crazy, she's an addict, she's a drunk, she's an alcoholic, to discredit her when she's reaching out to systems. They may oftentimes blame the survivor's mental health or substance issues for all of the problems in the family. They may use that as an excuse for why they have to control the partner. They will use a survivor's mental health or substance issues as a way to interfere with that, to undermine the parenting of that survivor, and make children disrespect the survivor and take away the authority of the survivor parent. They may, when the survivor wants to go into treatment or go into rehab or go to meetings, guilt that survivor for putting themselves before their children and their family and not being present for their children or their family. And oftentimes they'll use a survivor's mental health or substance use as a threat for how, if you ever leave me, I will get custody. No judge will give you custody. the judge will know that you take medication, that you go to therapy, that you go to treatment, that you've been in substance abuse treatment. No one will give you custody of those children, right? And so it's another tactic to keep that survivor present. And all of these tactics combined, right, really interfere and have a chilling effect on the survivor's ability to access safety and support and to retain custody of their children. And it's oftentimes one of the reasons why survivors really don't reach out for support, why they don't confide in home visitors and child welfare workers and CPS worker what's going on, because of all of the tactics and the fear that has been instilled in them and the distrust of systems that has been instilled in them. And oftentimes they blame themselves because the perpetrator has been blaming them for so long. And it's really important to remember that even though domestic violence and mental health issues often show up hand in hand, that victimization by an abusive partner is not a psychiatric condition, and being abusive is not a psychiatric illness. It's really important to remember that domestic violence and child abuse overlap and also intersect, and that in 30 to 60% of the cases, more recent studies show between 40 and 75% of cases where there is childhood physical abuse, there is also domestic violence. And so if you know one, child abuse or neglect is present, it is highly likely that there's also domestic violence present. If you know domestic violence present, it is highly likely that there's child abuse and neglect present. I want to be very clear, and when you're working and engaging with perpetrators, you want to be very, very clear that domestic violence is not caused by alcohol or drugs, a loss of control, poor impulse control, poverty, lack of education, another person's behavior, anger, stress. Perpetrators will use all of these as excuses for their behaviors. Sometimes survivors will believe that these are excuses for abusive behaviors. It is really critical for us as workers to understand that although we may see families that are under a lot of stress, we may see families that are living in poverty, we may see the intersections of mental health and substance abuse, those are not the cause of the perpetrator's behavior. And we need to be very clear about that. They may be contributing factors, they may be things that are making it worse, but they are not the cause, right? Abuse is always a choice, and perpetrators are making a decision to behave in abusive ways. And when we're engaging and working with perpetrators, we always want to bring it back to there is no excuse for your abusive behavior, and you can choose to behave differently. Perpetrators abuse because they want to control their partner, they want to dominate their partner, they want to manipulate their partner, they want to get their way. Oftentimes this is learned behavior. They may have grown up in a home where this is what they saw and knew. Oftentimes, unfortunately, this behavior is reinforced, right, by friends and family members who have some of those same beliefs. And oftentimes, unfortunately, the consequences for abusive behavior, the rewards, getting that power and control, right, and having that power and control oftentimes outweighs the consequences. Again, another reason why wherever possible, we want to be able to hold perpetrators accountable for their behavior and have them take responsibility for their behavior. Domestic violence is trauma. Trauma is an event or set of circumstances that is physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has long-lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and well-being. Survivors of domestic violence and children that are growing up in homes where there's domestic violence are trauma survivors. And we need to, often they will be responding and interacting with us in ways that is showing, that is a result of their trauma. Perpetrators may also have significant trauma histories, and we need to acknowledge that. We need to encourage them to get help and support for the trauma that they've experienced. But what we must never do is allow them to use those early childhood experiences of trauma as an excuse for their abusive behavior, right? We want to acknowledge it. We want to recognize it. We want to support them in getting assistance for that, but it is not an excuse, right? We know many people who are survivors of trauma, who grow up in abusive homes, who have substance use issues, who are not abusive to their partners and do not use coercive control. So I just want to check in, make sure everyone's doing okay, remind you that you have access to this support here. Maggie, is there anything in the chat box that you want me to address?
Yes, we received a really good question. How often do you see domestic violence cases where the perpetrator uses coercive control against a non-binary or trans victim? This can be through dead naming, using the wrong pronouns, or evoking gender dysphoria. Or the perpetrator uses their identity, especially in the current political climate, as a risk when there's a child involved.
It happens all the time, right? So one of those intersectionalities is gender and sexual orientation. And that is oftentimes where survivors are vulnerable. And so that is a place where perpetrators will, like you said, dead name, threaten to out that person, whether to their family members on social media, maybe to their faith community, anywhere that may not accept them. And so very, very often perpetrators will use, again, their own sometimes gender identity or sexual orientation to get someone to not call the police or not use those systems, because so it happens, unfortunately, very, very frequently. I just want to take a minute. Oftentimes sexual violence shows up. It's a part of gender-based violence. Sexual violence includes sexual acts or activities that happen without consent. It may include rape, sexual assault, and sexual abuse. Can include unwanted physical contact, including rape, molestation, groping, sexual abuse, can be by an intimate partner, can include child sexual abuse, and again, may or may not rise to the level of criminal behavior. 43% of survivors indicate that one or more of their partners tried to get them pregnant when they did not want to, or tried to stop them from using birth control. That is reproductive coercion. Again, another powerful tactic. Sometimes the pregnancy in and of itself is the result of a rape, with the intent of getting that person pregnant. And so it makes it more difficult for them to leave or get out of the situation. Perpetrators who are physically violent towards their intimate partner are often sexually abusive as well. And oftentimes there's even more shame and embarrassment about that. And people are often less likely to confide in you that that is something they are experiencing. DV offenders are 4 times more likely than a non-domestic violence offender to perpetrate incest. And children, particularly girls who are exposed to domestic violence offenders, are at significantly increased risk of incest. So again, when there's domestic violence present, or when there's child abuse or neglect, or you know that the child has been sexually abused, it is often likely that domestic violence is also something that's happening in that home. I mentioned earlier that the perpetrator's abusive behavior can cause harm to children physically, emotionally, developmentally, behaviorally, spiritually, cognitively. One of my favorite presentations to do is to really talk about, what children growing up in homes with domestic violence, all of the ways that that impacts them. And it really is across the board. Growing up with domestic violence influences our beliefs and how we see and move through the world. It really impacts every aspect of the child's life, or has the potential to impact every aspect of the child's life. How they see the world, their beliefs about relationships, how they perform in school, whether or not they want to go to school, their mental health, their physical health. So it's really important to remember that the potential for harm in these situations for children is great. As children become adolescents, we see a lot of times teen pregnancies, depression, nightmares, substance abuse. We see children getting involved in unhealthy relationships, unhealthy dating relationships. We see eating disorders. Unfortunately, the list is endless of the impacts that may happen. So I went through that all pretty quickly, but I wanted to kind of set the foundation and provide a reminder of really what domestic violence look like and where all of those intersections are and show up. You will see better outcomes for those that you're working with if you can recognize domestic and sexual violence and respond appropriately and effectively, and be able to make appropriate referrals. So I'm going to ask you in the chat box to take a minute and just tell me what are some general attitudes, beliefs, and misconceptions that a person may have about a perpetrator of domestic violence.
And while folks are chatting in, Bonnie, we did get a couple questions.
Okay.
This is a question regarding how often do you hear the reverse? So where instead of sexual reproductive coercion to get a female pregnant, do you see it where a female works to get pregnant when the man doesn't want to have a child? So the reverse there.
Absolutely. Yes, if the female is the perpetrator in that situation, one of the ways, right, that she can make that that male victim feel trapped is by getting pregnant. So absolutely.
And then
And
there's a
I
question.
really appreciate that question because I am now going to add that, right? Because we talk about that all the time and I don't talk about it in when the male might be the victim. And so thank you for that. That's excellent.
And then there was a question about resources, about the intersection between adverse childhood experiences and the effects of domestic violence.
Yes, so domestic violence is one of those original 10 adverse childhood experiences. And we know that when domestic violence shows up, that it is often likely that that ACE score rises because there also may be a parent that has a mental health issue or a substance abuse issue or is incarcerated. So yes, children that are growing up, that is one of the ACEs, and it is one of the ACEs that frequently shows up, right? There's also child abuse and neglect that shows up. And so oftentimes children who grow up in homes where there's domestic violence have those high ACE scores. And so all of those impacts that come with adverse childhood experiences are the impacts on the children.
And I will say, I can look for it, but I believe Prevent Child Abuse New York has just released a brief about the intersection between family violence and child abuse. So I can dig for it and try to find that link as well.
Awesome. That would be great. And after the presentation, because I know I'm not keeping up with the chat, if there's other resources that we can send out, I'm happy to look for those and to send those. I see a lot of really great things coming in the chat box in terms of this, and you're all right. So he just snapped. It was a one-time thing. They didn't mean to do it. They only did it. What did she do, right? Putting it back on, you don't have any bruises. The male is always the perpetrator, right? We tend to think that. They're abusive because of the alcoholism or drug use. Why did you make me do that? Yes. So this is amazing, right? These are kind of our biases and misconceptions. Oftentimes we think perpetrators are monsters. We think of them oftentimes as uneducated or poor. These are misconceptions, right? And biases that are going to interfere with our ability to identify cases and going to interfere with our ability to support survivors and hold offenders accountable. So we need to be really, really careful that we are aware of our biases. We all have them, and that we don't make assumptions. Remember that picture I showed you earlier, right? We look at that family, that picture on the left, and then maybe we know all these great things about them as a family, and we think, oh, couldn't be domestic violence there. As soon as we make an assumption about someone based on their appearance or their job or where they live, we are going to miss these cases. So it's really, really critical that we are aware of our attitudes, beliefs, and misconceptions, and that we don't let them interfere with recognizing and responding appropriately to domestic violence. So that's awesome. Thank you. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about how do we recognize domestic violence and what are some of those indicators of domestic violence, because that's the first step, right? Oftentimes we know there's data that shows that child welfare workers miss these cases all the time. And so we want to make that less likely to happen, right? So domestic violence may be causing or exacerbating substance use, interfering with their ability to get sober. And so it's really important to recognize what are some of the indicators and to not buy into what those excuses are for abusive behavior. What are some of the indicators that someone might be a perpetrator of domestic violence? Go ahead and put in the chat box some of the things that you think might indicate that someone is a perpetrator of domestic violence.
So we're seeing
Right,
control.
the need for control, right? One person speaks for both of them, putting others down, control. Yes, you guys are great. You guys are going faster than I can keep up with. Manipulation, they explain it away with their friends, needing to be in contact all the time. Inequality, yes, bruises, right? If there's physical violence, you may see answering the phone for them, right? That idea of looking too perfect. I think that's a great example, right? Because sometimes we think, oh, that family's so perfect, right? Every day have it together. Everyone looks so happy. They're both working. You know, the kids are always looking good and succeeding. That in and of itself can be love bombing. All right, you guys are great with all these indicators. So weird. Sometimes my screen does not want to advance. Oftentimes abusive partners have very unrealistic expectations for their children, for their partners, for their families. Oftentimes they feel very entitled, entitled to be in control, entitled to have their way, entitled to tell their partner what to do and how to do it and when to do it. Oftentimes they are extremely possessive and jealous. Oftentimes they may see their partner as their possession, and again, that they are entitled to control that person. Perpetrators are extremely manipulative. They are very, very, very good at manipulating survivors, manipulating family members, manipulating children, and manipulating the systems that are called in to protect survivors and hold them accountable. They are oftentimes very likable, very charming. When you are working with a perpetrator, oftentimes they want you on their side, right? They want you to see them as a good parent, as a good spouse. They want to present as the one that is trying to hold it all together. And they will oftentimes kind of slip in and slide in where the survivor is the problem, right? And oftentimes they'll do it in a manipulative way, like, you know, I'm so concerned because I've noticed my partner's been drinking more, or I try really hard to support my partner because I know she's depressed and sometimes she can't get out of bed and take care of the kids, right? So oftentimes they will use that manipulation, and that being very charming and wanting to be very helpful to us, as a way to manipulate us as home visitors, and to manipulate systems so that they are not seen as the problem and that the victim or survivor is seen as the problem. One of the things in all my years working with perpetrators, is that they are skillfully dishonest. They will come into offender accountability program or class and swear that something didn't happen, they weren't there, they would never, and oftentimes they were so believable. And so it would be sometimes difficult, right, to be sitting with this person, right? I have this information, maybe from the court, maybe from the probation or parole officer, maybe from Child Protective Services, maybe from a police report, viable sources, right? Valid sources telling me about the actions and behavior, and the person sitting in front of me, and the excuses that they're making and the way they're talking about it or denying it, they are so believable that I often had to remind myself, no, this is what they do, right? And you have this other information. So that skillfully dishonest is something to remember. Oftentimes people would come in and I would always think, all right, they're not going to tell me the full truth. They're going to leave out the details. They're not going to be fully accountable. But every time that someone would just outright lie, I would be like, oh, okay, they just outright lie, right? They just lie about things. And no matter how long I worked with perpetrators, that was something that I always struggled with, because oftentimes they are that believable that even when I know they're in this class for a reason and I know why, it's hard to put together the person that's sitting in front of me, right? That is very charming, very likable, seems very concerned about their family, is the same person that was using coercive control and violence to control their partner. And as a result, their children are also being harmed. To me, the biggest way to recognize perpetrators is that they minimize, they blame, and they deny. And so minimization, we see that all the time, right? It wasn't that bad. It didn't really happen like that. They exaggerated it. I didn't mean to. It only happened once. All of those are ways that they minimize the violence. They do that with the survivor, they do that with their children, and they do that with the systems and the people that are coming in to work with them. One of the biggest red flags to me that someone is a perpetrator is that blaming. Perpetrators very, very, very rarely take responsibility for their actions and behavior. So if they admit that it happened, right, and sometimes they do, they'll say, yeah, I did that. Then they will follow up with 600 reasons as to why they had to do that, right? They were protecting the survivor. They didn't want the survivor to go out and use drugs. They didn't want the survivor to leave their children. It was the substance use. It was the alcohol. It was their depression, right? And so it was the court's fault. It was the police officer's misunderstanding. It was the neighbor's fault who called the police, right? It was your mother's fault who said, I'm not a good father or good provider. The excuses and the blaming for their behavior is endless. So for me, when I was working in many different systems and many different capacities, even when I wasn't doing domestic violence work, it's just ingrained in me at this point. I'm always assessing, right, for domestic violence. It comes with the territory now. And so in any program that I'm working in, I was always listening for that minimizing, blaming, and denying, because that to me was a big indicator that someone might be a perpetrator of domestic violence. The other thing that's important to know about perpetrators is they often present as victims. And so they will show up telling you all of the reasons that they are the victim, right? They're such a hard worker and they're trying to take care of their family, but my partner's crazy and she doesn't take care of the children right, and she doesn't support the household, or she's spending money she shouldn't be spending, or she's having an affair. They will very often show up as the victim. They are very good at it. And the other thing that happens is they blame oftentimes the victims and survivors for everything, that sometimes survivors show up, right, and they take responsibility for what's happening or going wrong in the family, because that perpetrator has drilled into them so frequently that everything is their fault, that oftentimes victims will come in saying, sometimes I do get angry and sometimes I am too tired to make dinner, and it's probably my fault, right? So victims show up taking responsibility. Perpetrators often show up as victims. And again, it's just another thing to pay attention to when you're interacting and engaging with people that might be indicators or cues that someone is a perpetrator. All of that being said, right, there's no one thing that guarantees that someone is in terms of your interaction with someone that, helps you to guarantee that that person is definitely a perpetrator of domestic or sexual violence. But those are the kinds of, to me, the biggest red flags and indicators and things that you want to pay attention to that might give you a clue that domestic violence is happening in that house and who the perpetrator actually is. Domestic violence is very complicated, and it can be sometimes difficult to figure out if there is domestic violence happening, and if it is happening, who is the perpetrator and who is the survivor. I'm going to ask you now to, again, just in the chat box, if you could tell me, we want to talk about the importance of responding to domestic violence. But before we do that, I want to know, what are your concerns or fears about working with perpetrators of domestic violence? And I see someone in the chat box, and again, you guys are so quick in the chat box. Yes, I want to make it very clear that perpetrators may cause a survivor to have mental health issues, right? They may cause anxiety, PTSD, depression, right, from living with the domestic violence. They may have their own mental health issues, but a perpetrator's mental health is never an excuse for being abusive. And oftentimes, if a survivor does have a mental health issue as a result of domestic violence, once that survivor is out of that situation and is living safely and feels safe, oftentimes those mental health issues that may have developed as a result of the domestic violence, oftentimes when that survivor is safe, those mental health issues go away. And so I saw someone put that in the chat box. Yes, so I see lots of things, right? Will they leave the program? I don't want to overstep my bounds. I'm worried, and this is the biggest one that I hear, right? That if I intervene or if I broach this topic of domestic violence, I may not be allowed to be in that family. And then the services that I'm providing that are very valuable, the survivor and the children will not have those services anymore.
Mm. A
And
lot of our cups came in.
the other thing that I'm seeing is, right, that the concern about your own personal safety, and any violence are happening while you're there, or that your presence and engagement with the family then somehow makes things worse or more difficult for the survivor. And so those are obviously all the things that we want to avoid. And hopefully, if we can respond in the ways that I'm going to talk about, we will not, our presence will not make it worse, and we can provide increased safety for survivors and their children, and also maybe encourage perpetrators to access support and services. It can be really difficult to know how to approach someone who may be perpetrating domestic violence. We really may worry about saying the wrong thing or making things worse. So again, hopefully the things that we're going to present and talk about right now are going to make that less likely to happen. One thing that's important to do and that's helpful to do is to be prepared for engaging with perpetrators, right? I think it's safe to, anytime you're going into a family, you may or may not be aware that domestic violence is happening in that family. So when we're working with families, it's helpful to have as much information as possible, and to get that information from as many places as possible. We want to make sure that we are, before we engage with the perpetrator, that we are always respecting the confidentiality of the survivor, and that we are not sharing with the perpetrator things that the survivor may have told us, because that would increase risk to the survivor, right? So we need to always maintain confidentiality of survivor. We need to always make sure that safety is our first priority, our own personal safety and the safety of the survivor and the children. We need to make sure that our biases are in check so that they don't interfere with our practice and our engagement. And if we have concerns about our own safety, we need to really think about where and how, where do we want to engage with this perpetrator? Is it best to engage with them in the home? Is it, is it better to have an opportunity? Sometimes the perpetrator may be in the home when we go for home visits. They may be part of those home visits. And so we may have our engagement and our interactions there, which is fine, as long as we're aware of safety and what are we saying, and are we saying, we don't want to say anything, again, that the survivor told us or that may put the survivor at risk. Maybe that perpetrator is not living in the same home, but they want to be involved in the services, right? And so then thinking about, do you engage over the phone? Do you ask the perpetrator to come and have a conversation with you? Do you ask them to come to one of the visits? Again, you don't do any of that without checking in with the survivor first, and always asking with the survivor, what is the best way for me to engage? What is the safest way for me to talk to this person about their own children and how they can support their child's development, in this process, right? Always checking in with survivors. We must always be aware of your safety, of survivor safety and child safety. We know that the greatest threats to a survivor are separation. So, we always often think like, oh, why don't they just leave and everything will go away and they'll be safe? Separating is one of the most dangerous things that a survivor can do. And so we need to be aware, if we're working with a family where there's been recently a divorce or a separation, or the survivor is in the process of leaving that relationship, that is a really dangerous time. If we're aware that there is a weapon or a firearm in the home, that increases risk. If that survivor confides in you that the perpetrator has stalked them, that is an increase in risk. Unfortunately, pregnancy is also a increase in the risk, right? And so oftentimes you're working with pregnancy and early parenting survivors. So right off the bat, that increases the likelihood that there may be domestic violence, and that domestic violence has escalated as a result of the pregnancy or a new birth. I mentioned earlier threats of homicide and suicide, and really that controlling, jealous, possessive behavior. Those are the greatest threats. And so those are the things, if we are engaging with survivors and they are confiding with us, if we're hearing these things, we need to be aware that this could be a particularly dangerous situation, and we want to be checking in with our supervisors, and we want to be partnering with domestic violence programs and reaching out to domestic violence programs for support and assistance so that we can support the survivor in the best way possible. Working with abusive partners is challenging because all the reasons that all of who they are, right? Oftentimes they present as the victim, they lie, they manipulate, they may use the same tactics of power and control and manipulation that they use on the survivor. They may use that in their engagement, in their interactions with us, right? And so it does make it very challenging. What are your hopes and goals when intervening with perpetrators? What would you like to see happen as a result of engaging with perpetrators? And again, you can use the chat box for that. Right, you want to get them into therapy. You want to get them help and support. You want them to be motivated to seek support. You want them to take responsibility for their actions. You want them to acknowledge the harm that they've caused. You want them to take ownership. You want them to change their behavior. Yes, right. If you want them to stop blaming the victim, to get help and get resources. And I firmly believe that all of those things are possible, right? It's challenging. It's hard. It's difficult. Yes, I see Deanna. Does this ever really happen? It does happen, right? Again, it is hard. It doesn't happen easily. It doesn't happen quickly, but it is possible, right? And so I want people to recognize that it is possible, not easy, right? Doesn't always happen, doesn't happen quickly, but it is possible, because then we're engaging, right? Then we understand the purpose of that engaging with the abusive partner, right? Because we do have some hope that maybe they will be motivated to change their behavior, and maybe they will take some action to change their behavior. When we're engaging with abusive partners, we want to engage in ways that are respectful, that hold them accountable for their actions and behaviors. We want to call attention to them, as if the perpetrator is a male and a father, we want to call attention to fatherhood. And we want to begin to work and talk with them about how their abusive behavior or their controlling behavior impacts their children. The Safe and Together model talks about domestic violence and choosing to be abusive to your intimate partner as a parenting choice, and as a parenting choice that causes harm to their children. We want to use limit setting. We want to talk to perpetrators about safety. We want to keep our own and survivor safety in mind at all times when we're engaging with perpetrators. Just like working with survivors requires us to build trust and rapport over time, the same is true when working with perpetrators, right? They have a lot of reasons to not trust us, right? They have a lot of stuff to hide. They have engaged in behaviors that have caused harm to their partners and children. Oftentimes, many times they are embarrassed and ashamed about those behaviors. And so if we want to start to engage and move them towards being accountable and being able to have a conversation about how their behavior impacts their children, we need to take some time to build rapport and build a relationship with them. And that, again, is going to come out of engaging with them in ways that are respectful, recognizing their strengths. Oftentimes, perpetrators of domestic violence are doing many things with their children that require them that are good parenting skills, right? They're going to kids' games, they're supporting kids, they may be engaged in the positive bedtime routine. We can ask and engage with survivors about what are the strengths, what does your partner do that is beneficial and helpful to the family and to the children, right? And we want to start to engage with perpetrators, acknowledging those strengths as a way for us to build a relationship and trust and rapport, so that then maybe we can point out how some of the things that they're doing are harmful, right? And educate them about how they are harmful. Yes, Eugenia, they are great actors. There is no doubt about that. And I think too, we don't want to ever make an assumption that just because we tell them something and they say to us, oh, thank you so much for sharing. I'm never going to do that again. Or yes, I've done that and I'll never do it again. Just because they're saying that doesn't mean they're going to do it, right? We don't want to assume that they're not going to. We don't want to assume that they are going to do. What will show out, right, is over time, are they making changes in their behavior, right? If we really focus on their behaviors and their actions and not so much on what they're saying, it will start to be obvious if they are making changes and if they're really motivated to make those changes. We want to let abusive partners know that domestic violence is a choice, that there is no excuse for their abusive behavior, that nothing can force them to be abusive. I don't care if your partner cheated on you, spit in your face, called you names, embarrassed you, and there is nothing that can force you to be abusive other than you making a decision to do that. And there is no excuse, right? If your partner spits at you or your partner cheats on you or your partner embarrasses you, you can be angry, you can be hurt, you can express your feelings, you can choose not to be with that person anymore. But none of that is an excuse for you to be abusive, right? There is no excuse. You are always responsible for your actions, and you are responsible for the harm that is caused by your actions. We can acknowledge that they may have learned to be abusive. We can acknowledge that they may have their own childhood trauma, but we cannot allow them to use that as an excuse. They are responsible for taking actions and steps to heal that trauma and seeking support and assistance. It is not an excuse for them to be abusive. And we want to let perpetrators know that they can make different choices and they can change their behavior and they can choose to be non-abusive.
Bonnie, on that note of behavior change and noticing a perpetrator's behavior, we had a question in the chat.
Okay.
It was, are there, in your experience, and this might be hard to answer because it's kind of general, but it's kind of about like, are there certain offenders that you've noticed that respond better to help or respond best to help?
Yeah, again, that's a great question. My experience is that, right, you never really know at what point, like there's that tipping point, right? I'd mentioned earlier, sometimes the consequence, the rewards outweigh the consequences, right? So where is the tipping point of that? So for some perpetrators, it may be that the police were called. And then they're like, oh, okay, this is a problem, right? Maybe I need to change my behavior. They might just change it enough so that the police aren't called again, right? Sometimes we have things happen all at the same time. Maybe the survivor that chooses to leave. Maybe there's an order of protection put in place. Maybe they're not allowed to see their children. Maybe at the same time, they stop using drugs and alcohol and they rejoin their faith community. And so they're getting positive supporting messages from like 5 different places at the same time about the importance of changing their behavior, and they're getting the support to change their behavior. So you never really know, right? What is the one thing, or what are the main things, or the combination of things that are going to motivate someone to change? My experience is that it can be different for every single person, right? And that what we want to do is keep giving education information that you can change, you can be a better father, you can be a better partner, and also educating people that the choices they're making are actually also oftentimes causing them harm. You never know what's going to be the one thing or the combination of things that motivate someone to make changes. And that brings us right to this slide, right? That fatherhood oftentimes can be a prime motivator for perpetrators to change their behavior. Most men have strong aspirations to be good fathers. And so if we can tap into how their behavior is harming their children, and asking perpetrators, what kind of man do you want to be? What kind of father do you want to be? What do you want for your children? How do you want to raise? What are your goals? And get them to think about, are your behaviors and the ways that you're engaging with your family and children promoting the behaviors in your children and what you want for your children. And so I think that idea of being a good parent and being a good father is sometimes can start that motivation. We want to recognize and acknowledge the perpetrator's strengths and focus on the behaviors and impacts. Again, if we're going to have a relationship, if we're going to motivate, we need to acknowledge some of the things that they're doing well or some of the things that they're doing right. For some, it might just be that they're financially supporting the family. For some, it may be that they're engaged with their children. For some, it may be that they're modeling going to work every day. We can find strengths. Sometimes it feels like we have to work hard to find them. But when we're coming at it from a strength-based perspective, and we can talk to survivors, oftentimes the survivor can tell you, right? They oftentimes love this person, right? And they want this person to change. And they have at some point seen the good in this person and see the strengths. And so sometimes survivors can help us to identify those strengths. And again, that's just a good starting point to build a relationship and start to motivate that person. Okay, I want to skip ahead because we have a couple. Why is my thing not working now?
It appears like we have a little window pop up with your options for the slides. So you might just need to click out of that.
All right, I'm not seeing that. So that's weird. Oh, yeah, I can't. I'm losing everything.
Maybe if you just stop sharing and then reshare quick.
Okay, let's try that. Okay, here we go. And we want to engage with perpetrators in ways to hold them accountable for their choice to be abusive. We want to, in our conversations, in our engagements, again, we're going to be saying there's no excuses for coercive control or abuse. Constantly giving that message that you are responsible for your own actions, that you're making decisions. If we are aware that that perpetrator is supposed to be going to a domestic violence offender class, if we're aware that there's a limited or full order of protection in place, or that they have conditions of probation that say they're not supposed to drink. If we're aware of those places where other people are holding them accountable, we want to be constantly supporting and encouraging them, asking them, did you go to your class? How was your class? What did you learn in your class the other night? If we're aware that they're violating an order of protection, we want to partner with that survivor and talk about how can we help them so that that order of protection can be enforced. And we want to make sure that we are doing anything we can in our role that to support the perpetrator in complying with those behaviors. We want to be really careful about having family meetings because, and we want to follow agency protocol around having family meetings, but we may want to be aware that it may be not safe for that survivor to confide in or share certain things when that perpetrator is present. And we want to think too about when we're doing virtual visits, being aware of and really checking in with survivors prior to those visits about, is that a safe space and can you do that safely in a way that's safe and comfortable for you? Is there a way that you can let me know if something's happening that is uncomfortable or not safe for you? We want to make sure that our engagement and our responses are survivor-centered, that we allow survivors to make decisions and determinations about what's safe for them, that we listen carefully to what their needs are, that our responses are always culturally responsive. And again, I've already talked about using confidentiality. We want to make sure that we're engaging and providing services that are trauma informed, both for survivors and for perpetrators. Safety is a really important thing. You are not expected to be an expert in domestic violence safety planning. Your local domestic violence service provider or the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence hotline can help you in safety planning, or you can connect to survivors to those resources so that they can create safety plans. We want you to be aware in your documentation. Obviously, we want you to follow all of your own documentation procedures, but if you are documenting, that documentation may be useful to a survivor at some point in maybe a custody case or a visitation case. And so again, follow your agency and policies that you have to, but be aware that your documentation may be used in future in ways that may be beneficial or possibly harmful to survivors. And so you want to be behavior focused in your documentation. You want to point out any survivor strengths. And if there's any impacts of the perpetrator's behavior on the child, you can document that as well if your agency policy allows for that. If there's ever an emergency, you can call 911. You can call the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline or your local domestic violence program if there's one of those emergency situations where you're concerned. I have a couple scenarios. We've got a few minutes, so I would like to go through these. Monica's husband, Rick, is very charming when you visit the house. He is very proud that that he supports the family financially and that Monica does not need to work. He references that in their culture, the man is supposed to provide for his family. Monica wants to go back to school so she can go back to work when the baby gets older. She tells you Rick will not allow it. Monica shares that she loses sleep and doesn't function well during the day, and that Rick gets angry that she is not taking care of the house and the children to his standards, and he often calls her worthless. How can you engage with Rick as a parent in a way that is culturally responsive? You can just put some answers in the chat box.
And while people are answering, we've had some really wonderful
I
questions.
see some of the questions. These are the best questions I've ever gotten.
So what I'm thinking about is saving the chat, and if it's okay with you, maybe when I send my follow-up email, we could type up like a little.
I think that's a perfect idea. Yes. Thank you, Samantha. I would explore his values, beliefs, and where they originated. Yes, right? We want to, again, we talked about engaging in a way that's respectful. We talked about building rapport, right? And so that's exactly what you want to do. You want to ask questions. You want to have those conversations. You want to give him an opportunity to talk. We want to respect his culture. We want to respect his values. The problem is coming in, right, that his behaviors are coercive and abusive, right? And so we want to understand the values and beliefs behind those and respect the culture and respect the values, but we also want to educate about how some of his behaviors are impacting the survivor and the children and where those are problems. Yes, develop trust, make visits fun so that he can relax. Absolutely. Reflect on fatherhood and how he can help reduce the sleeplessness and improve the household as well. Absolutely. That's strength-based approach, that building the rapport, that listening, that engaging. And then once you've done that, you have a relationship, and then you can start to address where the problems are, right? And educate about the problems. I would say, wow, Monica, you're doing a great job, right? And we want to support the survivor always. Yes. Perfect. These are great responses. I'm sure we could spend an hour on this, but I want to go on to, we have a couple of these. So I want to go to the next one. Okay, so here is our second one. Jessica is pregnant. She confides in you that her first child, Javier's father, was abusive to her and that he recently moved out because she got an order of protection. He has stopped paying child support and has made false CPS reports against her. He has supervised visitors with his parents as the supervisors. He's fighting for custody of Javier and says he will also fight for custody of the new baby. He has agreed to meet with you and also wants your program support. So how do we work with Javier? No, her first, who is Javier? I'm getting confused. The first child is Javier. So the father of Javier is who we're talking about. How do we engage with him? This is my daughter's life. Oh my God, I'm sorry, Eugenia, that's terrible. So how do you engage? support the family by not doing family moonies so Jessica could talk freely. Right. So you want to definitely hear, and obviously you've had that because Jessica's confided some of this stuff in you. So you've had that opportunity. We want to be careful about recommending family counseling. If both parties want family counseling, that's fine, but we want to talk to Jessica. Is that safe? Right. And we want a counselor or a family counselor that is aware of and understands the dynamics of domestic violence and is aware of the fact that there's been abuse in the past and in the history. It's great, right, that the father wants to be involved. We need to be careful. Does the father want to be involved because he wants control, or is he really interested in supporting Jessica and helping the children to, meeting the developmental needs and all the things that home visitors do? Kill him with kindness until trust is built, and then nicely explain how his actions are affecting and will affect. Absolutely. Get to the basic as to why he agreed to meet with us, right? So you want to understand that. Again, we want to be strength-based. We don't want to make any assumptions, right? We don't want to assume, oh my God, it's so great he wants to meet with us. He's so interested in the, what's best for this new infant. And but maybe it's another way to gain and maintain power and control. So we engage with caution, we start to build that relationship, and we start to hold him accountable for doing the things that will really demonstrate until we see the behaviors that show that this person is making these classes right. A referral to a domestic violence program or domestic violence class, absolutely, right? These are all great suggestions. I think I missed. Yes, I missed our first one. Let's do this one quick, and then I want to just make sure you have all of the referral information so that we can get that to you. You've been working with the Smith family for several months now. Sierra tells you that her partner Marissa is really great with the new baby and often sings to the baby and offers to help at bedtime and bath time. Marissa works a full-time job and often accepts overtime to help support the family. She often tries to be present for the home visits or call home during the visits if she is at work. She is always appreciative of your services and how you are helping the family. Sierra recently told you that Marissa is drinking more, is easily agitated, and has been raising her voice at her. She confides in you that sometimes she feels afraid when Marissa yells at her. Okay, and so how will you engage with Marissa the next time you see her? Thanks, Dixie. I see an important question. We're going to answer these questions in a document. So I'm gonna wait on those. Yes, the recording will be available. I would do a cage or audit assessment with Marissa. Ask her how, well, they're coming in so fast, I can't read them. Ask how she's been doing, right? So you want to engage with Marissa as the perpetrator, right? So you want to recognize the strengths. Marissa's doing a lot, right? There are a lot of strengths that she has. She's really contributing to raising this baby and wants to be involved. And then again, as you build that relationship, I would ask about the drinking. I would ask about how the relationship's going. I would talk about how when relationships have stress, when there's new pregnancies, right, that we want to be aware of how that impacts our partner and how that impacts our children. And again, maybe make some of those appropriate referrals. Highlight the positive, yes. Explore coping and how she feels. Bring up the strengths. All excellent answers. Thank you. Okay, I want to talk about referrals now. We don't want to refer to anger management. Anger is not the cause of the domestic violence. Perpetrators are much more willing to go to anger management than domestic violence classes. Sometimes perpetrators have domestic violence issues and coercive control behaviors and are also angry. But we don't ever want to be in the position of saying that the cause of the domestic violence is anger. They are making a choice because they want to gain and maintain power and control. And oftentimes perpetrators manage their anger perfectly in other situations and settings. Not every county or community has a domestic violence or abusive partner intervention program. If you want to find out if your community does, you can reach out to your local domestic violence service provider. When you're considering a referral to a domestic violence or abusive partner intervention program, you want to consider whether or not that program is survivor-centered, trauma-informed, culturally responsive. Does that program provide a method of accountability? Do they promote behavior change? And do they educate the participants about the impacts of abusive behaviors on children and their partners? And so those are some of the things that we want to think about and consider. They're questions that we can ask our local domestic violence program, or they're questions that
Bonnie froze for me. Is everybody else having this?
when talking to survivors about these programs, we don't want to give false hope, right? We don't want to ever to present to a survivor that just because their partner goes to an abusive partner intervention program, that means automatically they're cured or fixed, or that they're never going to be abusive again. We want survivors to know that those programs can support change, those programs can motivate change, but that change is a process, that it takes time, and that perpetrator has to want to make the change, has to be willing to work for that change, has to be motivated to make that change. So we want to let survivors know that yes, perpetrators can change. They can make different decisions. They can choose to be non-abusive, but oftentimes their behavior is learned. It may be deeply ingrained in their belief systems. And so that oftentimes, unfortunately, change does not come easily. We also want to make sure that we're providing survivors with resources and getting them to those local programs. Maggie's going to put in the chat box all of the ways to to reach out to the New York State Domestic and Sexual Violence Hotline, to find all the sexual assault programs in New York State, all the local domestic violence programs across the state. She's also going to provide you with my contact information so that if you have any questions, I am always happy to respond in emails or to have a phone call. If there's any way that I can answer any questions, I am always happy to do that. Domestic violence programs provide a wide range of services. Sexual assault programs provide oftentimes these same services, and also can accompany people for forensic rape exams in the hospital, and help survivors to get those appointments. We're going to provide you with our survivor resource guide that will be attached in the materials that Maggie sends out. New York State has an address confidentiality program. You can find information about that on our website, which Maggie's also going to provide. Crime Victim Services provides compensation for victims and is another great resource. And before I do that, I want to really encourage you to practice self-care. And Maggie also put in the chat box the link to our, I can stay on for a couple of minutes. I don't want to keep you past time. I would so greatly appreciate if you could do the evaluation. The link is in the chat box. We can also send the link out afterwards. We really take any feedback that we get from our presentations very seriously. We incorporate that feedback into our other presentations. So please take a moment to do that evaluation. You can copy and paste the link into your browser, and that will take you directly to it. And I really want to encourage all of you. This is hard, difficult work. This topic in and of itself is difficult. So I really want to encourage you all to practice self-care. Take care of yourself as you're doing this really difficult work. I will stay in. We're a couple minutes past time. I will stay in for a couple minutes. If anyone has any questions or comments, and Maggie will follow up with you and we'll send you the answers to questions. Thank you, everyone.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to put my email in the chat box, and I tried to keep note. I saved the chat.
Okay.
So we will send a follow-up email to everyone that registered today with all of the handouts that Bonnie referenced, the link to the survey or the evaluation, so you can access it from there, as well as the links to our HVCI website, so you can take a look at the other trainings that Bonnie and OPDV has offered for us. What else did we promise? I did also want to acknowledge, just thank you. There was some wonderful discussion in the chat and people sharing personal stories. So thank you for the vulnerability there. So at this time, Bonnie, if we can stay on for a couple minutes, we do have a hand raised. But I'm going to go ahead and stop recording and